This keeps the charge. Okay, I hope it's going. It's a little choppy, but it's off. 6.30. Okay, thank you. Okay. It'll drop choppy the connection, but I hope it. Okay, I hope it goes.
Okay, good evening. So, wanted to use tonight to discuss some of the, as it said in the description, some of the highlights of the halachas of Yom Tov Sheni. I mean, what I'm specifically referring to, the halachas involving Bnei Chutz La'aretz versus Bnei Eretz Yisrael, and people that travel from one place to another, or people that are moving from one place to another, etc. What their din is. In other words, just as the basic background, we know that in the time of Chazal, when in the time that Kiddush HaChodesh was done al Piriyah, with Eidim who would come to Beis Din, and on a monthly basis, and based on that, the Sanhedrin would determine when Rosh Chodesh was. So they would then send out messages to all the communities, telling them which day was Rosh Chodesh, and hence in the month of Tishrei, which day would be Yom Kippur, which day would be Sukkot, and the month of Nisan, which day would be Pesach. And there were different systems employed, and the system that was originally employed of using the signals with the smoke signals was interfered with by the Tzedukim, and they had to replace it by actually sending out shiluchim, footmen, people to travel on foot, or by animal, whatever it was, to travel to the outlying areas and let them know. And there were places, particularly in Chutz La'aretz, although apparently there's some place in Eretz Yisrael as well, where they couldn't, the Shiluchim didn't arrive in time to tell them when Rosh Chodesh was, and consequently when Yom Tov was supposed to be. So there were times that they had an actual suffix, and they had to keep 2 days of Yom Tov be suffix. It was always just a shayla of one day or the other, because they knew when Rosh Chodesh was a month ago. The only question is the month that they just ended, was it Malay or Chaser? So did Rosh Chodesh, was Aleph Nisan, for example, was Aleph Nisan, was it Tuesday or was it only Wednesday? So Mamela, the shayla on Pesach would be, is Pesach the 15th, Tuesday or Wednesday? So they would keep on to both days. Then eventually, ultimately, when they no longer use the system of Kiddush HaChodesh HaPiriyah, at least temporarily, we're not using that system, and we follow the Luach, which was set up for us, and that Luach already predetermines which day Rosh Chodesh is, so there's really no suffix anymore, and therefore we technically should never have to should never have a suffix, and should never have to keep Yom Tov on anything other than the actual day. And the first day of Pesach should be Tess of Nisan, and the first day of Tishrei, first day of Sukkot is Tess of Tishrei, etc. Nevertheless, the Chazal said, the Gemara says in Maseches Beit, so that the Chachamim were afraid that given the instability of Jewish from life, meaning the fact that there's so many, we tend to go through so many forms of so many difficulties, forms of persecution, and tiltulim, and traveling, being uprooted from one place to another, etc. That they're afraid that Shema Yachsed Devil Kulo, even though we have right now a luach that's set for us, maybe things will get shaken up a bit, and we'll lose the luach, and we won't know exactly which day it is, and we'll revert back to a situation of suffix, and therefore they said minhag avosayim b'yadeim, we should continue things the way they were. And any place or let's say the way we approach it typically, chutz la'aretz in general, where most of the makomos were not able to get the message in time for Yantiv, so therefore chutz la'aretz as a rule has to keep. Yidden chutz la'aretz have to keep 2 days of Yantiv, even though we know for sure now which day is Tesvav, but we have to keep the dinim of Yantiv both in Tesvav and on Tezayin. That's true for Sukkot. It's true for Pesach. Now, really, technically, some Sofer points out it shouldn't be true for Shavuos, because Shavuos is there was never a suffix. Shavuos is Tisperu Chamishim Yom, and then V'krafta Mincha Chadash Hashem, and then you have Yantiv of Shavuos after 49 days of Sfir, the 50th day is Shavuos. So even if when Test of Nisan came around, they didn't know for sure which day was Yantiv, but by the time they got 50 days later, they knew. By the time they got to Shavuos, by then the Shluchim arrived, and they know which day really was Pesach. So Mamela, you know which day is Shavuos. So Shavuos never should have to be 2 days of Yantiv. There was never a suffix in the time of Chazal, and there should never be a din now either. So Chassam Sofer is masbir that nevertheless Chazal were afraid that if they're going to differentiate and say in Chanami Shavuos you only have to keep 1 day, people are going to be mezalzel, and the kedusha of the Yantiv think that it's not so chashuv. Like every other Yantiv, we keep 2 days. This we only keep 1 day. People are going to be mezalzel in the kedusha, and Memela they said that you have to keep Shavuos 2 days as well. And the Chassam Sofer is mechadish. Gvaldik Chiddush is in a tshuva in the first chelik of Baruch Chaim Siman Kuf Mem Hey. The Bir Halacha brings it down in one place. Chassam Sofer is mechadesh that therefore the dinim of Yantiv Sheni of Shavuos are more chamor than they are on the Pesach and Sukkot. That is to say, there are very few differences for Bnei Chutz La'aretz. There are very few differences between the observance of Yantiv Sheni as opposed to Yantiv Rishon, but there are one or two. We know that, for example, Kfuras HaMeis, technically speaking, one is allowed to be cover a mace on the second day of Yom Tif. When I say second day, I mean, of course, the second day or the last day of, Simchas Torah, the last day of Pesach. One is allowed to, Kfuras HaMeis is mutter, not only Kfuras HaMeis, but Kol Tzarchei HaMeis is mutter. The Gemara says, you're allowed to even, make tachrichim for the mace, even if he's not going to be buried then. But you're allowed to cut off hadas that you put by the guf, that it should have to deflect any odor, etc. So you're allowed to do kol tzarchei meis. You're allowed to do an yantiv sheni. In practice, that is not widely practiced. It's a big discussion in the Rishonim whether that should be done or not, because it's something that tend to lead to a chilul and zilzul of yantiv, meaning to say you're allowed to do tzarchei meis, you're allowed to do kfuras meis, but you can't just have the whole family get into a car or even get it on horses or whatever, travel out of the tchum to go to the levaya. Only the people that are necessary to be covered the mace could go do it. You can't have all the people that normally come to a levaya. And in the time of the Rishon already, this was a big problem of people not observing the halacha properly and leading to chil yantiv. So therefore the Rishonim that say you shouldn't do it. It's a shayla mamish ad hayom. In a broad scale, it's not done. On a broad scale, kavur is not done on the second day of yantiv. But in certain communities, in more tight-knit communities where there's perhaps more control, it is done. I remember in yeshiva, when I was in yeshiva in Queens, in Chavetz Chaim yeshiva, the mother-in-law of now the Rosh Yeshiva of David Harris, his mother-in-law, I think it was his mother-in-law, was Nifteris. I think it was one mamish like Erev Rosh Hashanah, right before Rosh Hashanah, and she was buried the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Even though, by the way, second day of Rosh Hashanah we normally don't. Is Yumarichta, but this din applies even Rosh Hashanah. The din of Tzarchei Meis, Nasim B'Yom Sheni, applies even the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And she was buried on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Remember, the Aron was brought to the yeshiva, and a few bachrim got into the hearse. Just a couple of bachrim who could actually do the actual physical burial, because then it's done on Day Yisrael. Even if you can get goyim, you don't do it on Day goyim. It's done on Day Yisrael, and a couple of bachrim went, when she was buried. And I remember then the Rabbi from Ginsburg, who was the administrator of the yeshiva, he had a shul. He was also Rabbi of a shul, which was connected to the yeshiva. The upstairs base measure served as a shul for Balabatim, and he commented after he said, I sure hope that none of my Balabatim saw what happened, that that a hearse drove up to the yeshiva on the second day, and then yeshiva Baruch, he said because he said it was always a big fight. They don't allow, for example, this is in Queens, even then, the Vada Rabbanim did not allow burials. The funeral parlors from funeral parlors in Queens were not allowed to do levayas on the second day Yontif, because what many Rishonim say, you shouldn't do it Kli Techil Yontif, and if it's going to be done on a broad scale, unfortunately that's going to happen. And he said he's had situations where he had to battle about this. It was a very touchy subject. The funeral parlors always wanted to do it, because unfortunately by the time you get to after a 2-day Yontif or sometimes a 3-day Yontif, there's Nebuch, there could be like a backlog. There could be, of Mesim, and if they could do Kavur the second day Yontif, it would make things easier. So he says if my Baltim saw the yeshivas doing, is like running a levaya on the second day Yontif, I would be out of a job, or whatever exactly he said. I don't know of other situations where it has happened. It has happened, but in any case, so that's one example of a kula Yontif Shein. The other example is lichalas ha'ayin, various forms of refuah in Yonim, which are not done typically on Shabbos or on Yontif, according to the Psak of the Magen Avram and the Mishnah Berurah, but it could be done Yontif. It could be done Yontif Sheni. Various forms of refuah. So the Chassam Sofer says that this doesn't apply the second day Shavuos. It doesn't. The second day Shavuos is more chamer than the second day of Pesach, or the second day even of Rosh Hashanah, or anything else. Why? Because all the other Yom Tovim, the second day was based on Safek. The initial observance of a Yontif Sheni was, sometimes it was Mamash Safek in the time of Chazal, and then even now that it's done, we have no Safek, but it's based on, since we used to have a Safek, so they said, Minhag Avosei B'Yadayim, let's keep it status quo so that we don't get back to a Safek. But Shavuos was never a Safek. It was a special Takanas Chazal that they were guys that they have to keep a second day of Shavuos in order not to be Mizal and Kedushas Yontif. So Memela was never based on Safek, so it's more Chamer. It comes out, almost counterintuitive. Rather than saying second day of Shavuos should be like the most light of, the lightest of them all. It's Adrab. Some Sofer is more Chamer. It was no gay, a very famous tshuva in some Sofer, where a situation in the town of Brod, where Rav Shlomo Kluger was the Rav, and there was a person who was a shchimira on the second day of Shavuos. He was nearing death, and they did not think he was going to survive, live past Yontif, and he was married and he had no children. So that means if he's going to die without giving his wife a get, she's going to need chalitza in order to remarry. And that was going to be a very big problem. He had a brother, but the brother, I believe, lived. Brother, I don't think was on the derech, and he lived somewhere out, and it was going to be a very big problem. They anticipated a very difficult problem, maybe impossible for her to get chalitza. So there was a push. So normally what they would do in a case like that is they would have him write a get before, the Gemara talks about this, write a get and give his wife a get before he dies, so that if they're divorced before he dies, then she doesn't need chalitza. So they want him to write a get. The problem is you can't write in yet. You can't write a get in yet because you can't write. Certainly not any kind of writing. Certainly not the type of writing a get. You can't do it in Yantif. So, but one of the Rabbanim in town, this was the Rav Eliezer Landa, who was a grandson of the Noda Yehuda. He was the Mechaber Sefer Yad HaMelech. He held that it was mutter to write a get on the second day Yontif, or any second day Yontif, Shavuos or any other Yontif. He held it was mutter to write a get. Why is it mutter to write a get? So one of his tainas is that you're allowed to do tzarchei hameis right on the second day Yontif. This man is a din of a mace. He's going to die. He's got one foot out the door. He's a din of a mace. So you're allowed to do tzarchei hameis. And so why is it tzarchei hameis? Not tzarchei hameis. It's tzarchei of the of the almana of the yavama. So he said, because it says in the Zohar that if a man dies and he leaves over a woman who's kuka liyima, needs yibum machalitz, and she doesn't get it and she's stuck, then there's a pagam in the neshama of the mace. His neshama is not complete. His menucha is not complete. Whatever it is, it's like a tying on him that he left over a wife who can't, who doesn't have a tikkun. So he said, Memel, it's a tzarech for him. He has the din of a mace, and it's a tzarech for his neshama that we should write a get for his wife. And he wanted to do this. Rav Shlomo Kluger was the Rav in town, and he said, nothing doing. He objected. He didn't agree, and he didn't allow it to happen. And if you read the Chuvas Chassam Sofer, I know some of you've seen it. If you read the Chuvas Chassam Sofer, you get the impression that the man Taka died in Yontif. The tshuva in the Chassam Sofer is from he's responding to Rish Shlomo Kluger. Rish Shlomo Kluger wrote after Yontif. He wrote to the Chassam Sofer asking. He said, could you please tell me if I did the right thing, not allowing this get? Because he says everybody, all the Rabbanim, all the Talmidei Chacham agreed with me except for one person. He doesn't name him. Who said I'm wrong. And I don't want this woman to have tainas on me. So he asked Chassam Sofer, "Can you tell me your opinion? Did I do the right thing or not?" Now, so you get the impression the man died in Yontif, right? That's so I found the tshuva from Shlomo Kluger, which he wrote on it. There's a sefer called Sheva Einayim from the Shlomo Kluger, where he has a number of tshuvas. And there is he wrote his tshuva too. I believe it's his tshuva to the Chassam Sofer. It's definitely tshuva on this topic. I think it's the letter that he wrote to the Chassam Sofer. And there's more of the history. I think that's where you see who it was, and who the Rav was. And apparently the man did not die on Yontif. What happened was, though, he had a resurgence. He had a turn for the good on Yontif, and he thought he was going to get. So he didn't want to write again. He thought he was going to get better, so he didn't want to write again. And this was, I'm sorry, it was even after Yontif. Even after Yontif. If after Yontif he was doing better, so he didn't want to write a get. When Yontif was over, when Shlomo Kluger would have been certainly happy to help him write a get, he didn't want to, and then he died. And he never ended up giving her a get. So it really almost like wasn't Shlomo Kluger's fault anyway, because the man survived past Yontif, but he could have, but had he followed the psak of the Reb Lezer Landau and written the get on Shavuos, then they would have had it. This way, the man was able to resist. He got better. He was able to to refuse, and then he died. So he wrote to Chassam Sofer, "Was I right for refusing on Shavuos?" And the Chassam Sofer writes back, says, "Absolutely, you were right." And so one of the things he ties is that what's the tzarchei ames here, based on Kabbalah, based on the Zohar. He said when we paskin halacha l'maisa, we work with Shas, and I think he says the midrashim, I don't remember the exact lashon, but the hachim mekubalim, like the most, we work with halacha l'maisa. We don't work with all the covet we have for the Zohar and for the Sifrei Kabbalah. I have to be careful, especially talking to close to like Bomer. I want to say the wrong thing, but it doesn't come into the picture for halacha l'maisa. We don't pass halacha l'maisa based on something in the Zohar, which is no makar and Shas, or it's against Shas. He says something like that in the Tshuva, and he says, "I'll bring you a raya," and it just very big kids. His raya is because there's a din that if a baby dies from son before a mila, so they do a mila on the baby, boy. They do the mila before they bury him. Why do they do the mila on a baby? He's not chayiv in mila. So he says that because it says in Kabbalah that that Avraham Avinu sits by the Pesach of Gehenna, and any yid that's sentenced to Gehenna, he tries to save him. He tries to save people going to Gehenna. But if somebody is an Arel, he can't help. And so it says the Satan, if a baby is buried with an Arla, the Satan takes the Arla off the baby and he puts it onto Poshe Yisrael, a guy who dies, who's Takamo, but he died with a lot of Averis, and the Satan's trying to get him. So he looks around for Arlas. Where does he find Arlas? On bodies of dead babies that were buried without a milah, and he puts that Arla. You could understand this as you understand it, no less than I understand it. He puts that Arla on the neshama or whatever of the Posheya that died, and then when he's sent to Gehenna, Avraham Avinu can't help him because he's an Arla. Look, he's got an Arla. He's not Mo. So in order to not to give any ammunition for the Satan, so we take off the Arlas. We do a bris milah on the baby. This way he's not an Arla. Just wait a second. So over. But if a baby dies on Yom Tif, and if he's being buried on Yom Tif Sheni, we don't do it. So why don't we do it? It's a tzarchei mace. There's some mace out there. There's some Russia out there whose neshama is going to be in a lot of trouble now because we're giving an Arla into the hands of the Satan. So why don't we tzarchei mace for this mace, whoever he is? He says that doesn't come into cheshbon and halacha. So he says neither does this. Yeah.
Do they do that by, let's say, a 50-year-old man who never had meatloaf? Do they do that same thing?
I think if the family would allow. Unless family, a man like that, it could be not in the hands that will do it. But if the family will allow it, okay. So in any case, so that's one thing. Besides that, anyway, besides which, even if he'd be right and everything about that's called tzarchei mace, but that's very nice on Pesach and on Sukkot, first days, last days. Rosh Hashanah, but not the second day Shavuos. It's like the second day Shavuos is Mohammed. There's no head of Tzarech Hameis on the second day Shavuos because, like I said, because it's not based on something. So all any kula that applies in the second day Yom doesn't apply on Shavuos. So that's what So Mamela, he's wrong. So he was wrong. That Rav is wrong, and he defends. He says for Shlomo Klug, he did absolutely right. You did the right thing. Nobody can have any ties on you, and if the man didn't want to give a get afterwards, that's not your, it's not your cheshbon. I mean, it doesn't say that. As I said, in Chasam Sof is tshuva. You don't even realize that the man survived till after. You have to see Rav Shlomo Klug's tshuva himself to get the historical facts to see what really happened.
Sam is the first one who brings this form.
As far as I know, the Bir Lacha doesn't pass on Rabbi Masa. He doesn't pass on Rabbi Masa, but he mentions it. Okay. Anyway, so this is all just basic. General background, general Yom Tov Sheni. So when it comes to to the idea of Yom Tov Sheni being kept only in Chutz La'aretz and not in Eretz Yisrael, so then the obvious question, or the obvious and the common question is, what about people who live in one place, they're their main residence, their permanent, quote unquote, permanent residence is in one place, but they're visiting the other place. So do they follow the minhag of, and the dinam of where they live, or do they follow the dinam of where they find themselves? Now, for most halachas, or let's say for many halachas, there's certain things that have to do with time. You go by where you are. I mean, if you go to Eretz Yisrael for Yom Tov, you don't say, and now it's 7:00 and the sun sets, and you don't say, I live in Chicago, wherever, Miami, so I have 7 more hours. I don't have to. It's 7 p.m. and it's sunset. I don't have to start Yom Tov yet. I have till 1 in the morning or whatever it is in Eretz Yisrael, because in Miami it's not Yom Tov until another 7 hours. That's absurd. Avada, you go by the time goes by where you are. So if it's Yom Tov, okay. So but this is not just a question of time. This is a question of this day. We know this day is Yom Tov Sheni. Does it have kedusha? For me, do I have to treat it b'kedusha? I'm in Eretz Yisrael now, but I live in Miami. Do I have to treat it b'kedusha, or do I not? So the halacha accepted, halacha psuka, is that yes, if we're talking about a person just visiting, he goes to Eretz Yisrael, amanas lachzar, he's planning moving back, and we're not even getting into it right now. We probably won't get into how do you define that. Let's say he's staying for 3 years, then he's going back, or he's probably going back. That gets into a lot of shilas, and we'll see, maybe we'll have time to talk about it a little bit. But this person we're discussing, he's definitely going back. He has every intention of going back. He's in Eretz Yisrael for Yom Tov, or just for 6 months, or whatever it is. But it's every intention of going back to Chutz La'aretz. So there we say, Nosin alav chumri hamakam sheyatsa misham, v'chumri hamakam shehalach l'sham. He has to keep. That's the general halacha by a person who goes from place to place. You have to keep the minhagim, or the chumras of the place where you reside and the place where you are. So Mamela, that's based on that. The poskim say that he has to keep the dinim of Yom Tov Sheni, because where he comes from, makom sheyatsa misham, they're not allowed to do malacha today, and they treat it like Yom Tov. So he has to treat it like Yom Tov. For every in every way, in every respect, he's not allowed to do malacha. He's not allowed to eat chametz on Pesach. He davens Yom Tov davening, and he doesn't put on tefillin. It's mamish. It's considered Yom Tov for him. It's considered a full-fledged Yom Tov, even while he's in Eretz Yisrael. That is the halacha psuka and mekubelas. There is one major shita in poskim that doesn't hold this way. That is the Chacham Tzvi, is a famous Shuva, the Chacham Tzvi, that he held that this is not correct. The concept of Nosin Alav Chumrei Hamakom She Yatsa Misham and Chumrei Hamakom She Halach Misham does not apply here. He says, why not? Where does that apply? That would apply in, let's say there's a famous case, there's a case in the Gemara of a certain trephus, certain illness or whatever it is, or a problem with an organ of an animal, which according to some is considered, makes the animal a treifa, and the animal is usher to eat, and others hold it's not. And there are a few examples of things which are totally minhag hamakom, like in Eretz Yisrael, they know it one way, and Chutz La'aretz the other way, or even within Europe, there are certain communities held Clara this way, and others held that way, based on who the Rabbanim were that set the tone, the halachic tone for that place. So there, if you come from a place where they hold this as mutter, this animal is not a treifa. It has this illness, it's not a treifa. You're allowed to eat the meat, but now you're in the place where they hold it is a treifa, so you're not allowed to eat it. So now there, the pshat is, if everybody from your place would move there, they'd also have to keep it. Meaning, there's nothing about the makom that says it is or isn't the treifa. It's just it worked out that in this place they hold it's not, in that place they hold it is, based on, like you said, who the rabbanim were or whatever. It has nothing to do with the makom per se. So Memela, since if everybody from your place would move to this second place, they'd also have to keep the chumrah. So now you have to keep the chumrah kol there. But he says here, if everybody from Chutz La'aretz comes to Eretz Yisrael, they also wouldn't have to keep. If the whole makom would transplant itself from Chutz La'aretz and go to Eretz Yisrael, they also want to keep Yontiv Sheni because it's totally on the makom. It's not just it happens to be that in Miami they do this way and in Yerushalayim they do that way. No, it's totally on the fact that in Yerushalayim they knew what their Yontiv was, and in Miami they didn't know what their Yontiv was. So Chazal made a gzeira on Chutz La'aretz and not a takana for Chutz La'aretz of Yontiv Sheni and not for Eretz Yisrael. So Memel, if everybody from Chutz La'aretz came to Eretz Yisrael, they wouldn't keep Yontiv Sheni. And it's totally Memel says the Chacham Tzvi, a Yachid also doesn't have to keep it. It's totally on the makom. And Memel, a person from Chutz La'aretz calls man he's in Eretz Yisrael, even if he's just there for one day or just for one Yontiv, whatever. He comes for Shuas, he's going back the next day. Doesn't keep Yontiv Sheni. That's Chacham Tzvi Paskins. There are a couple of other poskim that followed him that accept this psak. Notably, Reb Shmuel Mesalant, who was the Rav of Yerushalayim in the early 1900s, very early 1900s, he held this way. And he held this way also because he tainted that. He tiny the whole reason we keep Yontiv Sheni in Chutz La'aretz, some people Chazal say, is because minhag avoseinu biyadenu. Right? We do the way we always did. But he said in the time of Chazal, in the time of Kiddush HaChodesh Al Pi Re'iyah, if somebody from Chutz La'aretz was in Eretz Yisrael, he also wouldn't have to keep Yontiv Sheni. The only reason you kept it then, before the Gemara and Beitza, before the Takana, they kept it based on, because in Chutz La'aretz you have a suffix. In Eretz Yisrael they had no suffix. So if you were visiting Eretz Yisrael, you wouldn't have to keep Yontiv Sheni. You have no suffix. I'm in a place where everybody knows that today is Yontiv, tomorrow is not Yontiv. So you wouldn't have kept it. So how could, if it's only minhag avoseinu biyadenu, how could it make it more chamer? How could the person who in the time of Chazal wouldn't have had to keep it, now he doesn't have to keep it? This is what Rishon was not tiny. But Lamaisa, this was not the psak of the Talmidei Hagra who preceded him, who they bring there with, like his Rebbeim, who set up the Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim, back in the 1800s. They did not pass this way. Most notably, the Pa'as HaShulchan, who was one of the great Talmidei Hagra, who was from the establishers of the Yishuv in Yerushalayim, did not pass. And they passed not like the Chacham Tzvi, and he didn't want to, go out, go out on a limb against them. So when people would ask him, it's brought down, he would tell them to be machmer both ways. It seems. But now there's a tshuva from the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber, the Shulchan Aruch, the Beis Yosef himself, the tshuva is Avkas Rochel, where he also says not like the Chacham Tzvi. He says not like the Chacham Tzvi. He says that you have to keep if you're visiting yourself, you have to keep Yontiv Sheni. In Shulchan Aruch, it's not brought. There is a siman on these halachas, siman Tav Tzadivav, towards the very beginning of Hilchos Yontiv, but the Shulchan Aruch does not discuss the case of a ben Chutz La'aretz who's in Eretz Yisrael. He discusses only the other way. Sif Gimel, B'nei Eretz Yisrael, Shabo L'Chutz La'aretz, what they do. Hold on for a minute what he says, but he discusses what they do, but he doesn't, where the Chacham Tzvi wasn't speaking about that case, he doesn't discuss the case of B'nei Chutz La'aretz who go to Eretz Yisrael. So someone to say, someone to say he was chayzer, even though in the Avos Karochel he paskin against the Chacham Tzvi, but someone to say he was chayzer, and that's taken out broader Shulchan Aruch. Lamaisa, the bottom line is halacha lamaisa is pretty much nimnu v'gamru in the from belt, in the Torah belt, that we don't pass on the Chacham Tzvi, and we pass in if you're visiting Eretz Yisrael and you're planning on going back to Chutz La'aretz, you have to keep full Yontiv Sheni. Now, the question is what happened in areas of suffix. In some of the questions, like I mentioned before, there are many cases of suffix of people who they're uncertain about their plans. And so we know this is a major shaila, and there are opinions that are drastically different for each other. Like a Shiva Bacher goes to Israel, and and he's probably going to go back to Chutz La'aretz, but would he settle if things work out well in yeshiva? And then would he settle here? Might certainly if he's finds a shidduch here, yeah, he finds a shidduch, he'd probably settle here. He's not opposed to it right now. He has no such plans, planning going back, and he's being supported by his parents. So there's a whole discussion and a lot of whether he keeps 2 days and 1 day. We typically say he keeps 2 days, but those that say differently, or people who move with their family, but it's supposed to be a 1 year thing. 1 year, they go on he has sabbatical from work, so he goes there himself for the year. He still has his job back there, his house back there. They're renting an apartment in Israel, planning on going back. But if it really works out well, and we start liking it, then who knows? So then these types of cases, or I have a couple that's called me a number of times in a row where they've been in Eretz Yisrael now, a young couple. They've been in Eretz Yisrael for a number of years now, but he has a small position in yeshiva there, but nothing with real permanence. He wants to go into a field of Harbatzis Torah, and he says he can't imagine he's going to get a job in Eretz Yisrael. It's overwhelming possibility. A likelihood is that he'll find a job only in America, and he'll go back to America. We'd love to stay here, but can't say we're planning on it. So he called me a number of Yom Tov, and it changed a little bit. His approach changed. I mean, his attitude as to likelihood of staying had changed. But in any case, without getting into details, these things are shilas. So the question is, in cases of shilas, do we use the Chacham Tzvi as at least a cheshbon, as a factor towards put it on the balance on the side of keeping only 1 day? Is it a factor, or no? Do we say absolutely not? The psak is like the Al Kisracha, like the Beis Yosef and all the poskim have followed him. That is the absolute psak, and the Chacham Tzvi is not a factor in these shilas. So that's a machlokas poskim. Just to mention two names. I got this from the Sefer Yom Tov Sheni Kilchasa. By the way, you can find all of this, of course. He says there's machlokas between Rav Elyashiv and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Elyashiv did not work with it at all, and he's also medayik from Rav Moshe's Tshuvas. Rav Moshe Paskin is against Chacham Tzvi, and he doesn't seem to even take into consideration at all in any of the cases where he deals with the shilas. Shlomo Zalman held differently. Shlomo Zalman held that it is a factor to be reckoned with. If you have a suffix, it is something to put on this, to help you machriya the shaila. Okay. Now,
does the Gemara discuss this shaila about, like, Ola Regal, for example? Wouldn't that come up every single Yom Tov? I don't know with Ola Regal when the Yom Tov.
But Pashas, the Al Chiv Aliyah the Regal is only if you live in Eretz Yisrael. You have to go from a different city to Yerushalayim.
They're not going from.
No, it's a shaila whether you're even chayiv. They definitely wasn't the primary. Like when they make the cheshbon of when we start saying Mashiach Mardi Goshen, basically it's till the last person gets home, not to Florida or Chicago. The last person gets home to the farthest place in Eretz Yisrael. There's a tosim psachim. It's not pashut yechayiv in Aliyah regular even close Florida. Okay.
So there's no.
No, I don't believe so. I mean, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch here, where he talks about Bnei Eretz Yisrael who go to Chutz La'aretz, so the Beragola quotes Orchas Chaim. But may uvda the Rami Bar Chomach. It does say Chum Dav Kuf Yud, but it's not a mefurish anymore. I think the psak. So the psak for Bnei Yisrael in Chutz La'aretz is who are planning on going back. They be'etzem they only keep 1 day. Like in theory, in practice, they're not allowed to do any malacha or anything that you can't do in Eretz Yisrael. Anything that you can't do that a ben Chutz La'aretz can't do, they can't do either. Mipnei machlokas. It says they're not allowed to do any malacha according to the psak of the Mishnah Berurah and Achrona before. Even b'tzina, they can't do a malacha. But davening wise, they daven 2 weekday davening with Cholamoyed or the last day mamish day. They put tefillin on at least the last day. And they're the second seder they don't make any bracha on al chil's matzah mara. They don't have the mitzvah. I mean, if they're with a family, they'll sit with the family and go through the emotions. But they're not l'shem mitzvah. They have no mitzvah v'chil's matzah more than anybody does the rest of the yontif. They have certainly no mitzvah v'chil's mara, and they don't say halal, etc. I mean halal, like the seder. Okay, but they have to act like they're not allowed to show anything different. In fact, just to give you one example, there's a machlokas from Moshe and Shlomo Zalman. If a person makes Havdalah, Ben Eretz Yisrael, who's in Chutz La'aretz, so does he make Havdalah after the night? Let's say it's 2 weekdays. Goes from like we had this year, right? It was the first days of Pesach, right? Sunday night to Monday. Sunday night. I'm sorry. The Yom Tov was Sunday and Monday, right? So Sunday night going into Monday, should they make Havdalah or not? Right? They made Havdalah for Shabbos. They made it already the night before. We all did. This is a question of Havdalah from Motzei Yom Tov. Do they wait to make Havdalah till Monday night, like Bnei Chotzar says, or Moshe says? He says they should not make Havdalah because Havdalah is like a mafursin thing, and they're not allowed to make Havdalah. Shlomo Zalman says differently, that they have to make Havdalah in between the 2 days of Yom Tov. There's no candle; it's not a Shalom Malacha, right? Just Yom Tov Havdalah, just a Havdalah of course. So Rav Shlomo Zalman passes they have to make Havdalah. Rav Moshe passes they shouldn't make Havdalah. But as I said, L'gabi Malacha, not allowed to do. So I once saw a psak from Shlomo Zalman. Actually, I think I saw it. I'm pretty sure it's in this Sefer. Pretty sure that's where I saw it. That he talks about somebody from Eretz Yisrael who came to Chutz La'aretz because his one of his parents was ill, and he came to spend time with them, to visit them. But the day of Yom Tov, the first day of Yom Tov, he didn't spend. His father, or whoever, was in either a hospital or some other medical facility in a place where there were no Yidden around. So for the actual day of Yom Tov, he went to to spend with a from family in a community. And question was, could he travel then the second day to see his father? He came, but after his father is only going to be here a certain amount of time. So from what I recall, he was matter in that situation. He was matter him to dress up like don't look particularly Jewish, and that he could. I think he allowed him to take public transportation, which is no real malach involved in public transportation. I don't know if he had to go out of the tchum or not, but very likely not if he's in a big, in a big city. And he allowed to take public transportation and to go to be able to become, to be mevakar chala, to spend the time with his father in a way that tried not to, nobody should have any clue where he was going to be. There were no Jews around. It's just a question of the place that he was leaving from. Okay, but that that was a chiddush that he allowed even something like that. Typically, the person has to conform totally with his surroundings. Now, there's a very interesting case where I've seen this case happen Lamaisa, and I've seen it in this farm too, where two people get engaged to get married. So let's say the case, I remember this case happening 35 years ago in Chicago when I was there, where a girl from the neighborhood got engaged to a boy from Eretz Yisrael, and the wedding was going to be held in Chicago about a couple of weeks before Pesach, and they were going to move. They were going to live in Eretz Yisrael. She was going to, move to Eretz Yisrael. He lived in Eretz Yisrael, and they were going to live in Eretz Yisrael. But he was coming to Chicago for the chasna, and then they were going to stay over Yom Tov, stay with the parents-in-laws for the first Pesach, and then moving after Pesach, they're moving to Eretz Yisrael, lock, stock, and barrel. So, what is the shaila? What is the din of Yom Tov Shem? Now, of course, okay, for him, it's Pasha. He's a Ben Eretz Yisrael, so he inherently keeps one day, but again, which means the second day he davens chol and he puts on tefillin and etc. But he can't do malach, like you just said. What about his wife? At that time, they'll be married already. By the time Pesach comes, they'll be married. So the psak was, she keeps full 2 days. She has to keep a second seder, and she davens Yom Tov, etc. She's a bas chutz la'aretz. Now, she never lived there, so she's planning on moving to Eretz Yisrael, and they have, they're going right after Pesach, but physically she's not there. She hasn't made the move yet, and that's pasha. Let's go back a step. That's pasha. Let's say I decide that I'm moving to Eretz Yisrael. I decide now, get a job there, or anybody going to get a job there, and rent an apartment, buy a house, buy an apartment, whatever it is, all set to go. Leaving after Yom Tov, you're going to be here through Shuas, and then 2 days later or a week later on the plane, moving to Eretz Yisrael without intention of coming back. It's pashit that he still keeps 2 days because he's still a ben chutz la'aretz. He's planning moving to Eretz Yisrael, but your status doesn't change by your plans. If your plans are in conflict, so to speak, with your physical location, if your plans conform with your location, then it's different. For example, let's say you're in Eretz Yisrael and you're planning on going back to Chutz La'aretz, and then you decide while you're there, I'm staying, absolute firm decision. I am not going back. You rip up your return ticket, whatever. I'm not going back to Chutz La'aretz. I'm staying for whatever the cheshbonos are. So then you become a Ben Eretz immediately. Whenever it is. It's even a shallow. What happens if it's in the middle of the yontif? Does your din change in the middle of the yontif? But certainly, if it's not in the middle of Yontif, then absolutely. If on Erev Yontif you decide, Erev Pesach, you decide I'm staying, whatever you just got the call from the job application that you've got, the job is yours, and so you decide that's it, I'm staying 100%. I never expected to get that job. I got it. I'm staying. So then you're Ben Eretz Yisrael immediately because you're in Eretz Yisrael and you decided you're staying. So you're Ben Eretz Yisrael. But you can't become a Ben Eretz Yisrael just by if you're in Chutz La'aretz just by deciding. So the only chiddush here was that, but she's married to a Ben Eretz Yisrael. Normally we say the wife follows the minhagim of the husband. Whatever, if he's Sephardi, she's going to start eating rice on Pesach, and etc. etc. But Afal Pikein Legabi this, the poskim say, many poskim say this, that it does not go by that. It doesn't go by the minhagim. He could be a Ben Eretz Yisrael, and she's a Bas Chutz La'aretz, and it's no steer, and that was the psak they got. And I see that there are many poskim that paskin Svei Lamaisa that he keeps only 1 day plus the way of Ben Eretz Yisrael keeps 1 day Chutz La'aretz, and she keeps a full 2 days. So the case I discussed, I don't know if any of you were here on Pesach on the second night. I discussed the following case, which is I thought also a very fascinating case and that of a non-Jew who goes to Eretz Yisrael and completes his Geirus. Let's say just to make it more realistic. He was working Geirus here for a long time. He's been into it for a year and a half, this and that, and he's mamish getting towards the finish line. And he's gonna, and the based in here makes arrangements. They speak to based in Eretz Yisrael, or maybe he's even gone to Eretz a couple of times just to meet with them, whatever it is. But they make arrangements based in Eretz Yisrael that they're going to meet. He's going to come on Chayes Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and he's going to meet them, and they're going to meet with him, and if he meets their expectations, if everything that the basin has been working through in the past year and a half said, if they find it all to be true, and they agree that he's Roy Figueres, they're going to meet him in Eretz Yisrael. So he goes, and sure enough, Baruch Hashem, meets the standard, meets the mark, and they megar him, and it's a week and a half before Pesach, and he's every intention. He lives in Miami, and he's every intention of traveling back to Miami. He has his job, he has his house, he has everything here. Now he's a Yid, and he's going back, but he's staying for Yontif already. He's a Yid in Eretz Yisrael. He's not going to leave before Yontif, so he'll stay for Yontif. So what is his din? Is he a Ben Chutz La'aretz or Ben Eretz Yisrael? What's the shayla? On the one hand, you say, well, he's a Ben Chutz La'aretz. We just said he came from Chutz La'aretz, and he just there temporarily is going back. So maybe he's a Ben Chutz La'aretz. Or do you say no? And says the Sefer B'Tzel HaChachma, and the Shal shows B'Tzel HaChachma in the printed Tshuva, and Rav Yashav, according to this Yontif Chasa, agreed that no, he's a Ben Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because the way the B'Tzel HaChachma says, what do we say? We put on him Chomri Hamakam Sheyatsa Misham. He says he never had those. He was never part of those chumras. He never was part of that kehila and that part of that oilam. He was a guy when he lived in there in Chutz La'aretz. So he had no shayah. You can't say about him Chomri Hamakam Sheyatsa Misham. That's a person who was part of the kehila, where this, even if the halacha never applied to him. Let's say Yontif Shein never applied to him for whatever reason. We'll give a case maybe in a minute. But this guy, he was never a part of it. He wasn't Jewish. He never had a shaychus to those chumras. So now he first became Jewish in Eretz Yisrael. So now the minhagim Eretz Yisrael are kovei with him. Okay, he's moving after Yontif. Fine, he's moving. It's like any Israeli who's moving after Yontif. This Yontif, he's still an Israeli, full-fledged, full-blown Israeli, even though he's moving the day after Yontif. So this guy too, he's an Israeli, and you can add it's like Kakat and Shinola Dami. It's like his whole existence just started now vis-a-vis halacha. So the fact that he physically lived in Miami his whole life, and that's where his house is and his job is and his everything else, it doesn't make a difference. From a Yiddishkeit perspective, says the B'Tzel Chachma, says Rabbi Yashiv, he is a Ben Eretz Yisrael. Rosh Hashanah disagreed, and Rosh Hashanah Paskin, no, he's a Ben Chutz La'aretz, and he brought a shtickle raya, which we have to understand, but his raya says, or a raya or a dim, he says, what would you say about a case of a person who, we have to go in a minute, but a person who lived there his whole life, and then he decides he's moving to Chutz La'aretz, he's moving the day after Sukkot, he's moving to Chutz La'aretz, so he said, okay, this Sukkot he keeps 1 day, Pashit. They move to Chutz La'aretz, That's it. Now the Bnei Chazar. Then what comes before Pesach, they decide, let's go back to Eretz Yisrael for Yom Tov to visit the folks. Not moving back. Just they get a 2-week ticket back. So they're in Eretz Yisrael now for Pesach. So they were never in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, they're never in Chutz La'aretz in Yom Tov. Never. They never spent a single Yom Tov in Chutz La'aretz. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman. But of course, they have to keep 2 days. There's a Ben Chutz La'aretz. He became a Ben Chutz La'aretz by moving to Chutz La'aretz. Now, even though it didn't apply to him, the din of the Chumrei HaMakom never applied to him because the very first Yom Tov he's visiting Eretz Yisrael, but he's a Ben Chutz La'aretz, and he has to keep 2 days. So he says the same thing here. So this guy, this ger, it never applied to him the din, but he was a Ben Chutz La'aretz. So look, one Chari could hear a little different. That the Yid becomes a Ben Chutz La'aretz, so Taryag Inyanim, Taryag Mitzvahs, and Taryag Minhagim, whatever, apply to him. He never had an exam. He never ate from that tray for meat either, which is controversial, but it still applies to him. But the guy the ger who was a guy, you could say he had no shaykhs to it. It never applied to him. It wasn't just that he never had an exam. He never had an opportunity to perform it. He wasn't part of it. So okay, but in any case, it's a machlokas. So Rabbi Yashav and Sal Chachma says he keeps only 1 day, and Rosh Hashanah says he has to keep 2 days. Okay, well, there's a lot more here, like 100 times more, but that's why it's not. Hopefully next week, we're going to start learning Hilchas Kibbut Avein, following pretty much the save of Shulchan Aruch and Siman Reish Mem and Yeridei. Be'ezus Hashem. Thank you all for joining.
What does the Chacham Tzvi say about the opposite going to Eretz Yisrael?
The opposite, he liked the Shulchan Aruch. In other words, yeah, because there is not a question of Chumrei HaMakom. There is not a question of Chumrei HaMakom, Halach Hashem or whatever.
Oh, that's telling you who you are.
Because the reason why you have to keep there's no takana. There's no takana at all on a Ben Eretz Yisrael to keep Tashim. There's no such takana. So he has to conform so that people don't think that he's not from. So he has to act like. But actually, he's a Ben Eretz Yisrael. There's no takana.
It's a similar svara
In the
times of them, right?
But the point is that I think there that the takana of Yom Tov was only on Bnei Chutz, only on Bnei Chutz. No takana on a Ben Eretz Yisrael. It's not part of that din.
Okay.